Space communications. These will be among the main topics for dialogue.
Care, respect, these are so foundational to anything that it should be. That for me is sustainability.
Hey Seetal, good to see you.
Yeah, you too, Dan. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you? You've been keeping well?
Yeah, really well actually. I think the lockdowns treated me quite well in terms of my own health. But I'd rather be in Bali right now, obviously, than here. But yeah, all good otherwise.
We'd love to have you back in Bali as soon as the whole lockdown's over. We'd love to have you back. I'm sure you'll be back with us pretty soon.
Yeah, let's hope.
So there's the lockdown pretty much. How's things over there? Is it starting to calm down a bit, or is it still pretty full on?
No, things are easing up week by week, and most people are returning to work. People are seeing each other. I'm seeing my friends, so it feels like there's a new energy, I guess. So that's quite nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, moving away from the virtual space a little bit, which is healthy, I think.
Yeah, change is definitely in the air, and let's hope it's a positive one, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the work that you've been doing for quite a few years, I think is going to definitely come to the surface. I don't think it's ever been more relevant. When you launched in 2015, I think it was. Yeah, it was a huge inspiration for me, Matter, and your work, of course. I just sensed when you launched back then, I just kind of sensed that this was going to be the future. And I think in today's world, it absolutely is. It's a necessity that we really start re-looking at these things, you know, looking at systems and design and materials and everything, and work on how we can build a more sustainable future. And I think materials definitely have the answers for that. Just for anyone that isn't a designer or doesn't work in the realms of materials, why do materials matter? And, you know, could materials help us build a more sustainable world?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you think about materials and where they come from and how they're made, everything is made from something, and that is the material. So they matter on so many different levels, whether it's like the nanoscale or the mega or the macro or the meso. It has so many impacts to our lives on a daily basis, or immediate, near and far futures. They have an impact throughout. And we need to really understand what they do, their behavior, the systems around it, the ecosystems that are surrounding them as well, in order to understand how we can start to relate to them. And that relationship needs to be a bit more humanized, which is kind of what my practice does, basically. So humanizing materials means that we can build a more sort of a relationship to the materials so that we can start to understand them. So reframing materials in a way that we understand their characteristics, their behaviors, their practicalities and their functionalities as well. So like when it does come to like designing, we design spaces or places or objects by understanding how they should function and feel. So if we understand materials in the same way, so how does a material function and feel? We can start to build those bridges between the material and the human. So therefore, it becomes more empathetic, it becomes more caring, it becomes more respectful, And all of these sorts of value systems need to be part of the way in which we engage with materials, but also the way in which we apply them as well. So we need to build more respect for materials, because I don't think that's been present for a really long time. And that is down to the way that we consume as a society and how that's impacted the planet. And that has been quite damaging, because we've seen materials as a resource and a resource for humans, and we haven't really considered the impacts that they create beyond our human consumption, because it feels like it's quite opaque. It's not as transparent enough to us, because we don't understand the supply chain, we don't understand the end of life, because that's not really presented to us in a way that we understand it, because it's quite technical, it's quite scientific, it's also very academic. And that work is really, really important. But we also, as a larger society, and humanity is ever growing, obviously, and more people need to understand materials in order to have a more respectful and caring relationship with them, so that we understand how to reduce our consumption in certain areas, or it really affects our habits and our mindsets, and that will inform how systems are created and designed ultimately. So I'm trying to make materials more accessible and relatable ultimately, in order to form healthier relationships to them. And that will have an impact on systems, hopefully, ultimately. So materials can actually be designed for durability, or they can be designed for biodegradability or disassembly, and they can be multiple things. There's so many systems that materials can be designed within, that we haven't really unpacked that enough yet, I think. And I don't think every single material is meant to be scaled at the rate that they previously have. I mean, we know all the impacts that plastic has had in the world, especially in Indonesia. And I think that has been down to human behavior, the capitalistic system, and also the fact that we haven't really understood the material's capability, because actually that material is meant for durability, whereas it's actually being produced for disposability, and that's really problematic. So by not understanding or relating to that material, the impacts that has is quite great, and really damaging. And we need to kind of heal from that trauma somehow that has generated, in order to form healthier relationships to materials and really understand them. So by humanizing those materials, we can then begin to build those connections, and it feels a bit more relational, basically.
And you mentioned there, Seetal, the population growth, and not everything is scalable. And I think one challenge that myself and a lot of my friends have been facing when running companies or running brands is moving to more sustainable production. And a lot of the bigger companies, I think, especially really want to make the change, but there's a lot of challenges in terms of the materials that you're working with are fantastic. The super it's innovation, it's sustainability, it's all the things that companies are looking for, but quite often they're not scalable. And this seems to be a big challenge for a lot of people I talk to. How do companies look at moving forward, maintaining the volume whilst doing it sustainably? Is that even possible? And do you think that's a challenge that a lot of people are facing that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main question I get asked whenever delivering a talk actually is, how can we scale this? But I don't think that's really the question we need to be asking, actually, because I think the question really is, how do we... It is about degrowth as well as it is about scalability. So we need to really question what the material capabilities are that we want to transition to, because not all materials are meant to be scaled at that rate, because the same sort of problems might incur like with plastic if we abuse it to a degree where it's actually not suitable in the end, or it's this idea of one material places another. And I don't think really that's the question we need to be answering. I think it is about more about understanding what the material capabilities are in order to address a systemic issue. It's more systemic than it is a design problem, and it's not looking at it as, oh, here's a problem and here's a solution. I don't think it's that we really need to be addressing. I think what we need to consider are alternatives rather than like one material solves a problem, because I think more problems will happen, along the line, and that is very sort of present in the plastic problem. That is very present everywhere. And I think this sort of universalism is really problematic when it comes to production or material solutions. I really don't like this word solution and problem, actually, because it just feels like, oh, it's solved and therefore we don't need to do anything else about it. And that seems like a forever solution. Whereas if we sort of reframe it in terms of like, oh, we can offer alternatives, and materials have this sort of diverse nature which encourages biodiversity, actually, if we use materials or work with materials, should I say, in a collaborative spirit, and understand that they have these very different qualities and they can be achieved at multiple scales and across multiple systems. And I think it's more about readdressing that first, rather than thinking, oh, this material can replace this, and therefore we've solved it. And actually we need to do deeper diving and work within, like, what is it we're actually questioning here. And I've developed a methodology in order to address that, and it's not necessarily looking at it, it's a stage by stage process rather than it being like an overnight answer or solution or view on how we can address it. Because like working with these brands and companies, a lot of the time it is like for like, we're trying to replace something, whereas actually, if you are understanding, oh, these are the types of qualities we're aiming for, and there might be materials that already exist that just can be transformed in a way that can provide those qualities that you're wanting to achieve. So it is also looking at the materials we already have, because we do have a lot of materials at our disposal that are ready to be manufactured, actually. Things like, we have 160,000 unique materials in the world available to us, and yet we don't utilize them to their full potential. And so a lot of materials aren't reaching their full potential. And we need to somehow return to some of those materials. I'm not saying that we don't need alternative materials or new materials, but I do think there is something in re-looking at the materials we already have available to us in order to achieve a more sort of sustainable level of production. Because I think if you have all these supply chains already in place as a brand, sometimes it might just be rethinking the way in which those materials are applied. Because one, like Adidas's Futurecraft Loop shoe, that's entirely one material, but it's just processing lots of different textures in order to achieve the qualities in which the shoe can actually comply with. So that is a really interesting system, looking at the versatility of a material and how many ways in which you can treat it or process it in order to achieve like something solid, something flexible, something soft, and all of these sort of behaviors. And that is already, those materials are already existing. It's just how we treat them, and then therefore understand how we can apply them, and they can be scalable in a different way. But I do think we need to also look at the multiple systems that are involved, that we can actually, that materials can actually work with, whether it is disassembly, whether it is versatility, or whether it is durability or biodegradability, or even open source. There's so many ways in which materials can be designed into in order to achieve something that feels like is representative of that material, and it feels like it can achieve the desired effect, I think. So there's like a 3-stage methodology that I've put in place, which has then like gone into a wider framework that I've built as well. And initially it's trying to create an identity for the material. So we need to understand how the material functions and feels, because currently the materials are described as typologies, so wood, metal, plastic, glass, this kind of thing. And in order for you to understand those materials, you really need to be an expert in them, because you don't know how they behave or what they can be useful for, because they just get pigeonholed in this really rigid box, which actually is really hard to understand, because textiles, for example, just gets put in a box in a materials library. And actually textiles are made from so many different things. It can be made from cellulose, which is from a tree, or it can be made from recycled plastic. There's just so many materials involved in making one material, and glass can be transparent, but it can also be opaque. But they have completely different uses, for example. So we need to reframe and recategorize materials, and that's something that I'm doing in my practice, is so that we understand the behavioral qualities, the emotional qualities, as well as the functional. And then we understand how to apply them into the spaces, and the people experience it or reside within it in some way. We then understand the life cycles of those materials. So understanding where it's come from, how it can be used, how it degrades, and is there reuse potential. So then it goes into systems and how we apply those materials. So then it's looking at durability, disassembly, versatility, and all sorts of things like that. So it's really about initially changing our mindsets, which is the reframing of the categorization, which then informs our behaviors, which is the life cycles, and then it informs the systems around them. So narrative driven, behavioral driven, and then systems driven. So that happens over a period of time rather than something that happens overnight. But I think it is very much about wanting to understand, really getting to the bottom of what it is you're trying to achieve before we understand how to scale something up so much that it actually might cause more problems than intended. So yeah, it kind of has to follow some sort of structure like that. Sorry. But yeah, I think something similar to that would be more useful than finding a like for like material. I don't think that that's very healthy, because ultimately this is a systemic issue.
Absolutely, yeah. I think when you mentioned our behaviour and our current patterns, I think the deeper question of the level of consumerism, globalization, companies selling billions of pairs of shoes and then sort of turning around and saying, all right, let's make it sustainable now. I mean, maybe there is a deeper question in saying, well, is this the right way of running a business? But then it goes down to profits and shareholders, and it's a very complex structure we're in at the moment. And I understand it's not easy for big companies to shift, but I think as a consumer, I think there's a lot of opportunities on our side to change our patterns. And if we, the consumer, and the general public, do start changing our behaviours and realising that our purchasing power is a way of actually helping the environment and just generally sort of relooking at the way we do things, I think that could be a potential way of making change. And you also mentioned the plastic issue. I mean, I'm in Bali, and it's not only Bali, it's all around the world, but because I'm close to the ocean, I see how bad it actually is. At certain times of the year, it's catastrophic how bad the beaches get, and it's a huge problem. Do you see any alternatives out there in terms of replacing it? Obviously, of course, we have the single-use mindset, which I think needs to be completely eradicated. I think that throwaway mentality of use something once and then just throw it away, I think it's not the right thing. So that's one question. And then, on a second note, do you see any alternatives to plastic if we are to maintain a single-use culture? I mean, in the supermarkets, there's literally hundreds of thousands of single-use plastic in one supermarket. When you travel on a plane, like go on economy, you get, I think last time I flew, can't remember which airline it was, but there was about 28 pieces of single-use plastic on one tray. Now that's just ridiculous. So we've sort of gotten ourselves in this mess. It's a pretty big question, but how do we get out of that mess? And is there a material that could maybe come to the rescue?
Yeah, it's a big question. 28 single-use plastic items on one tray.
Yeah, I counted it because everything had a film lid. Every tub was plastic, then a film lid, then there was a piece of plastic which had plastic toothpicks in it, then there was a plastic straw, then there was a plastic fork, then there was then it just kept going on. Then there was cheese, and then that was in 3 pieces of plastic, then there was butter, the butter's 2 pieces of plastic, then there's bread, the bread's in plastic. There's 28 pieces of single-use plastic with one meal. Times that by however many millions of people travel every year, or billions of people are traveling, then that's a problem. So how do we relook at that?
Oh, I mean, I will begin by saying it's not plastic's fault. It's humans' fault that this exists. So plastic is a really intelligent material, and it's just being abused, actually, to a degree where it wasn't really intended for those purposes, actually. It's just become something that's really easy to produce, really cheap to produce, and therefore most companies want to abuse that potential because it actually drives profits. So it's a capitalistic issue. And that's the major issue with plastic. It's behavioral, it's systemic, and one that is driven on greed than more than anything. So it's human behavior that has actually caused this problem more than anything. So ultimately, we really need to address our relationship with plastic being something that we can't abuse to the degree that it has been. Thinking about plastic as a material and how it's actually really intelligent because it's hygienic. It can be, most of them can be recycled. There are a lot actually that can't be recycled, but it's hygienic. It's, you can clean it, you can wipe, it's wipe clean, it's washable, it's durable, it's recyclable to some degree, but plastic needs to be used for longevity and not necessarily used for disposability. And that's something people need to, producers and manufacturers need to readdress for sure, and not just produce it in a way where it's meant for disposability. But if it is meant for disposability, there needs to be some kind of accountability involved from the brand or the producers or something like this. So whether there's a higher tax levy or whether there's an accountability in terms of they need to have accountability for the recyclability of it, or only recyclable plastic is actually produced. Because we've got so much plastic available to us, a lot of that needs to be recycled before we can even begin to understand what its replacement is. And I think before plastic, there was glass, But we can't really use that as a replacement now because sand is actually really becoming quite a scarce material, and we can't then necessarily start extracting that for human consumption. But I think even just having this behavioral change by using reusable cups, coffee cups or this kind of thing, that is already sort of integrating some behavioral change within our daily lives. And those daily acts or rituals, perhaps, that we sort of embrace is changing a larger system. And I think more acts like that or behaviors like that need to be embedded more strictly. And I think that's a governmental, a policy change that needs to take place. And it's a top-down and a bottom-up approach that needs to be working together in coexistence. And whether the government sets certain taxations or, fines or anything like this if new plastic is generated, because also oil is something that is, we're losing oil. Oil isn't something that we can actually rely on forever. So there needs to be some emphasis on a post-oil world as well. So we can't keep producing plastic at the rate we've been producing it at. So I feel like initially what needs to happen is recycled plastic needs to be put into the system to some degree to combat some of those issues. But then throughout that sort of process where recycled plastic is being generated for these disposable items, throughout that period we need to think about do we need these disposable items? It's a life of convenience more than anything, that this is why this plastic exists. It's for human convenience. And actually maybe what the work that you guys have been doing at Potato Head, for example, making sure that no single-use plastic is entered into the premises. I think that as a behavior change mindset really starts to inform other areas in people's lives. They're oh yeah, actually I don't need that, so you start to, that bottom-up approach is really crucial because it's almost like an activist approach, and maybe it's a delicate activism of sorts. But I think a lot of these sorts of behavioral changes needs to happen as well as policy changes needs to happen. So they need to happen in tandem. But I don't know I couldn't say that there's one solution for it or there's an alternative, what the alternatives are. I think they are obviously biodegradable plastics and things like this and bioplastics that exist, but bioplastics, for example, aren't biodegradable. So there's a whole composting system that needs to be part of that life cycle. So a bioplastic does have a tiny bit of oil in, so it can't be just composted naturally. So you need to then break it down with a composting machine, and then it can be ground into granules and therefore can be reused to some degree. Whereas biodegradable materials are materials that can actually biodegrade naturally in compost. And that will take maybe 3 months or 2 months, depending on the thickness or the density of that particular material. So I do think there are alternatives there that lie there, but I'm not saying that they will be replaced entirely by plastic products. I do think it is a behavioral one that we really need to address. I think we need to think about what utensils we might carry with us that actually are meant for durability, whether it is our cutlery or whether it is a reusable cup. I think we'll almost be carrying our own tools or utensils with us as well. I think more and more people are doing that. I know it's very inconvenient for people, but this, I think, is only a positive change. And I think more and more of that is happening. I would say so, but we need to be careful as to, we can't just say, oh, we're going to replace single-use plastic for this material, because I don't think that's the solution. I think it's a deeper problem than that. So knowing that there's 28 different types of plastic on one tray, that's not necessary. It's completely unnecessary. And I don't know how to solve something like that without doing more, research behind it. But I think, what about textiles? What about cloth? What about like beeswax, muslin cloths? Or, there's so many ways in which food can be kept fresh. There's even like very basic things such as paper bags. Like what's wrong with those things? Cardboard. There's so many materials that are so basic that we haven't really understood how they can be used. It's even going back to how we used to purchase things by weight, like whether it would be taking your own containers or paper bags or things like that. I think there's so many ways in which those types of behaviors can be integrated in our daily lives. But like an aeroplane, you could have cloth. I don't see any problem with that. Like bread wrapped in cloth. That's totally fine. Or the food could be fresher. I don't know. There's so many ways in which it can be, rethought. It doesn't have to be wrapped in plastic.
I think you're right. It's as simple as just saying, "Well, just make the food fresher." but that should be the way it's done, right? So, well, don't vacuum seal everything in plastic that sits on the shelf for 6 months. Just make it fresh. But I guess then you run into challenges of, well, there's going to be more costs, and we can't do the volume that we were producing at before, and there's more labour costs. So again, it's this complex series of challenges which companies run into. But at some point, we need to stand up and say, okay, enough's enough. We need to completely readdress this. Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere. And companies do have a big responsibility. And I feel in the current climate, with the pandemic, airlines more than anyone are the ones suffering the most. Now it's time to really sort of stand up and show people, okay, we're going into a bit of a new era. We're going to start producing more sustainably. Do things, now's the time to I think implement new systems and new procedures. But yeah, how do you break down the doors of the shareholders and the cost versus, all of these challenges that you run into? So yeah.
I think there are alternatives out there. It's just whether people are willing to implement them. There are definitely things out there. Paper bags and cloths, honestly, they're really suitable. I don't see any issue with that. Even if they were to use like ceramic, that's also fine. Like, it's reusable, it's washable. Steel even, I think, like, a lot of Indian culture, like steel plates are used on a daily basis. They're so durable and they're renewable entirely. Like every time you wash them, it's renewed entirely. It's antibacterial and all sorts of things. So what's wrong with metal for things like that as well? So, and that's quite reasonable. I'm not saying that everything needs to be replaced by metal, like everything plastic needs to be replaced by metal, but for an airline, I think that could be quite interesting.
Yeah, well, we actually produced, I don't know if you saw it when you were in Bali, and we probably worked on it a bit together as well when we were working closely at Potato Head. We developed a zero waste kit. And essentially the idea behind that was because we know that when people travel, we're trying to take the waste out of travel as much as possible. And generally when people come in, they bring toiletries and sun lotion and skin repellent or mosquito repellent, things like that. Generally that always comes in plastic, like toothpaste. So we developed a zero waste kit that everything was reusable. And as you mentioned, it was metal containers, and we used bamboo and wood as well. So it comes in a recycled plastic bag, which you can reuse, totem bag. In there was the container, there was the cutlery, there was all of the lotions, everything you need to sort of survive when you're on holiday, all the essentials. And people really got into that, and they could easily bring it downstairs, we would refill it for you, it was free of charge. And a lot of people were like, wow, like they wanted to take it home and sort of utilize that when they get back to their daily lives. And I think that is something which people are open to using, but I just don't think there's enough people offering that product out there. I think it's still a relatively new thing. I think we're still in our infancy. But for sure, people are open to that. And I think it makes a bit of a statement whenever you're traveling or whenever you're going out and you're doing your daily shopping or you're grabbing a coffee, to actually go there and say, I won't accept plastic, can you please put it in this? And just, it might be a little bit more work, it might be a little bit more inconvenient, but we all have a duty as human beings to, raise our game, live a bit more responsibly, and make sure that our children, our grandchildren don't have to pay the price for our misuse of material and the bad choices that we've made.
Absolutely.
And have you I know in your materials library there's a few things I was looking at, such as the seaweed and the mushroom, and there's a bunch of interesting biomaterials or natural materials which, using different methods, could be turned into what feels and looks like plastic. Do you feel that there's an opportunity there, or do you think that that's not quite ready yet to really make impact?
I think there's definitely an opportunity there. There's lots of possibilities, should I say, with all of those materials. But at this present time, I think in terms of its credentials or certifications, in terms of commercial use, and it's still got a little while to go, I would say. And especially with seaweed, I think that's still very much in its infancy, actually. And the scalability of that is kind of interesting, because the versatility of a material such as seaweed, it's kind of endless, actually. It can be fuel, it can be textiles, it can be natural dye, it can be, oh my god, so many things. It can be a solid material, it can be like printable ink even, and also insulation and all sorts of things. Like, it's used for thatching in Denmark, for example, on housing, but it's also got insulatory properties. It's quite incredible as a material, but because we have so much of it in the world, and obviously it grows in water, so it doesn't need any extra resources to, like land materials such as cotton, for example. It doesn't need those extra resources to grow, and it's entirely renewable, it's regenerative and all sorts of incredible things. And it also produces like up to 80% of the planet's oxygen. It's wild. So knowing that it has these purposes and benefits to the planet, we need to be very mindful as to how we then work with it. And I think if it does provide 80% of the planet's oxygen, once we extract that, when do we put it back, or how often do we put it back? So we just need to have this sort of exchange, or give and take sort of exchange, making sure that as much as we take away from it, we need to put it back in. And that's something that hasn't sort of happened enough of with materials, because we've been very extractive as a society, because we've just thought, oh, it's a resource, so we'll use it for human use. And we need to be more mindful or conscious actually, of the way that we treat materials. But so saying that, like, the scalability of it is something that is being looked at on multiple levels, and people are trying to think about, well, researchers are thinking about, like, where is it best positioned? And it can't be a solution to everything, but it does have so much potential, like, across lots of things. I think as a textile, I'm really excited by that. I think it does offer also biodegradable plastic alternatives, which are really interesting, because the single-use sort of behavior can start to be diminished somewhat, because it can be biodegradable after single use. well, yeah, one use even. But yeah, I don't know if it's a solution, but I think it's an option. I don't think it has the potential yet for it to be scaled to that degree. It definitely doesn't have the investment yet that it needs to do that kind of work, which I think is another conversation actually, because a lot of these materials are really new and very experimental these days, and mycelium being one of them as well. So mycelium and seaweed kind of have a similar sort of relationship to one another because they're seen as these wonder materials and offer so many options available to us because they can do so much. But the investment that goes into it is quite a lot to develop something that's actually commercially viable, and I don't think many people are doing that enough. And I think maybe there's an opportunity for a brand to take on that role of becoming like an investor in developing new materials. And I think that role could be a really amazing one. Not only will that brand or company have the possibility to be like, I'm not talking about exclusivity, but they could license this kind of technology, for example. I think that's something that Patagonia has done really well with this natural rubber that they developed for wetsuits. And then they've developed that technology and then they've licensed it out to other brands, surf brands in particular, so that they have access to it. And I think this conversation is about access and access to materials so that other people can actually be part of that conversation as well as that lifestyle. So if a brand was to potentially invest in something like that, then I think that's only going to benefit not only the brand but also others. And I think that's the conversation that brands need to be having these days, and not one of exclusivity but one of sharing. If anything that's been revealed throughout this pandemic process, well, this whole period of lockdown and the pandemic so far, is that we are willing to share more than ever, actually, because we are all experiencing this at the same time. It's a global issue, and sharing hasn't been more essential than ever, I think, right now. And I think we need to be doing more of that, if anything. So I don't think it is about exclusivity, it's about access. And these materials provide that sort of access. And I think humans can't be dominating anymore. So we can't dominate materials in the way that we have been doing. So materials need to have their own rights to some degree. Like the material needs to have their own agency and say to us, actually, oh no, you have to listen to us now. So materials might say, oh no, I'm not meant to be scaled up to that degree right now. So you might have to wait a bit longer because I'm not ready yet. Or my behavior is towards flexibility, or I'm more rigid. So there needs to be a deeper dialogue happening with the material. So we need to understand that first before we understand how to apply it or work with it. So he's seeing materials as a collaborator more than something that's a resource is where we need to be going. So seaweed and mycelium are live materials. They're living. So we need to value that, the fact that they are living. We are also living. So we need to have that kind of dialogue with them and value them as living beings, as well as what they can actually achieve for us and with us more than anything.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned how, on the subject of seaweed, how it could potentially open up, we think we found a solution, but then we abuse something. Even though the material might be more friendly, we then abuse it again. And you mentioned it's almost the laws of nature. You can't take something without giving. I think that's just generally a rule of life. Like you can't expect to take something and not give back. I think that's what which we all need to sort of rethink. And yeah, I guess it's behavioral issues, and I almost feel like as designers, as companies, as brands, we need to just relook at the design principles again in terms of what constitutes good design. Okay, yes, aesthetic, yes, form, yes, function, but it doesn't end there. Sustainability, sometimes it's on that list these days, or in most cases, very rarely it's even on the list. If it is on the list, it's generally close to the bottom, like, is this sustainable? We're not quite sure. So I feel we need to sort of relook at that design principles again and put sustainability at the forefront as possibly just number one. And if it's not sustainable, then that instantaneously becomes bad design because you're constituting or you're making something which fundamentally is killing the planet or is harming the environment in some way. So regardless to how good it looks or how great it works or functions, it's then automatically bad design because it's harmful to the environment. So I feel like relooking at the design principles is something which we need to readdress. And if that could be done on a level of the government stepping in and sort of enforcing these laws and saying, okay, we need to implement better design practices and companies should follow these rules. But again, there's so many complexities in governments and systems that are old systems which need so desperately to be broken. But how we're going to do that's another matter. But I found it is generally by and large private companies which are trying to make a change. You mentioned Patagonia, and we've been doing that on a very micro level here and supporting local communities and getting zero help off the governments. But I think governments do that. It's now the time to really step up and look at the climate issues, look at the waste issues, and really start changing our ways. And as a designer, or you describe yourself as a translator over a designer, what do you mean exactly by that?
Yeah, it's been quite a conscious shift, should I say. And that's happened recently. So a few months ago, well, for the longest time, I've been questioning the role of a designer or the word or the term designer or design itself. And it's a word or a term that feels quite egotistical because it's one person generally behind design or designer. And it's one that is about naming. And, if I say myself or Seetal Solanki, I'm the designer of this, and it sounds like I've done every single part of, that product. Whereas actually there's been so many other people involved in that. I can't take all the credit. I don't think it doesn't sit with me as well as maybe some others do, but like the material itself is part of that. The people who have sewn something or grown something, that's a whole supply chain, everybody's involved, right? So how do we acknowledge that? Because it's not just me. I've just put it into a form. I've also made it aesthetically pleasing, potentially, all of these things. So my role as a designer I was been questioning it because it's one that I feel is connected to ego, and also the fact that the term design or designer isn't translatable across multiple countries or cultures. And so if I'm having a conversation with somebody from an indigenous culture or, a craftsperson, for example, that's a whole different conversation, and it feels like a hierarchical one somehow. When I describe myself as a designer, it feels like, you're a designer and therefore you're an expert and you know exactly what you're doing and I should listen to you. And actually, no, this is an exchange. This is a dialogue and a conversation rather than one of hierarchy. So I really wanted to eliminate that sort of hierarchy and for that not to exist. And for the fact that design or designer is a term that isn't translatable across multiple cultures affects my work, because I work internationally quite a lot. Even during the pandemic, I'm still working internationally virtually, and I'm very conscious of the fact of the kind of people I'm working with, because sometimes it can be cross people, and it can be having a conversation with an indigenous culture a lot of the time, and I want to be very respectful of that, and for it to be a dialogue which is open and one of exchange and sharing. And that was very present, I think, with the trips that we did together in Bali, for example. And I think that whole sharing and exchange of skills and knowledge was just so incredible to me. And having rethought that, like, as how I describe myself as a designer is one of translation, because materials are something that are translated as well. So materials are translated across multiple applications, multiple processes, and multiple disciplines. Like seaweed was the example. In a way, it's kind of like, well, if I translate this material into a textile, it can be utilized for this. If I translate this material to a biodegradable one, it can be used for these things, these purposes. So, and also because materials are like a conduit between so many different sectors and disciplines, I'm translating across I'm having multiple conversations with multiple languages, because every industry has its own language. So rather than thinking of myself a designer, I'm more of a translator across all of those sectors, disciplines, with materials, and one of cultures, multiple cultures as well. So it just felt more fitting, and one that isn't driven on just expertise, but one that can be somehow translatable and relatable. I think that's kind of where I'm heading with it. So it just feels like a lot of what I'm doing is diminishing the human ego, basically. And I think by, shifting my role to becoming a translator feels one which was necessary in order to do that, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think elevating the makers, you mentioned all the suppliers, the people who are doing the sewing or every part of the process, if we can, rather than just saying, okay, this is designed by X, you could say, actually, this was designed by this community of people from all different walks of life, and and you could almost tell that story. And I think that type of narrative, I think would actually appeal to a lot of people. I think that's something which we should probably really look at doing more, and brands should really start looking to that. And also, it would really show a bit of transparency in the production process. And I think brands, one thing that I've been thinking about when looking at, okay, how could this globalization and all of this culture of mass consumerism and big volume, how does that work on a level of sustainability? And when you look at, for example, a footwear brand that produces all of their, or majority of their footwear in Indonesia, but then they ship that all around the world, they're probably not even paying tax here. And I think, like, could we go back to, and again, this is something the governments could maybe implement, could we sort of force these big brands, instead of having this global monopoly of saying, okay, if you want to continue this sort of mass global volume, fine, but you must only manufacture in countries where you're selling it. Mm-hmm. So then, for example, if you wanted to manufacture in Indonesia, you'd have to sell those products in Indonesia. You're not flying them all around the world several times, which is quite often what happens. If you're producing in Germany, you sell in Germany or within a small range. So then you're providing jobs in different territories. You're then cutting all of the carbon emissions. And I think then you've got these little micro businesses under one brand. I don't know if how easy that would be to set up, but to me that seems like quite a interesting solution. And then you could, bring back local manufacturing, bring back the old craftspeople, bring back all the old factories which which are maybe closing down now in a lot of the Western countries. So yeah, that's quite an interesting way of looking at it and telling that narrative and bringing craft back to the forefront, and maybe looking at future craft using these old techniques, the old wisdom that we have, but using it with modern materials. I think that could be a pretty interesting solution.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, because then it's one which is about economy, it's one which is about policy, it's one which is about society and the environment. Imagine using local and native materials in that narrative as well, and therefore the wisdom of that land or that place or that culture is still living. And I think that is a really important narrative to be telling, because it's one of nuance and not one of universalism, and that encourages a more sort of biodiverse sort of approach, and it's one we need to be heading towards, not one of monocultures, basically, which is kind of where we are right now. It's like this whole homogenous aesthetic or process or production system that is involved, and actually not, the world can't operate in that way. We're all really unique and different, and especially with the cultural differences. And kind of going back to your thoughts on design principles, actually, because what's really interesting about design principles, it's another thing which is framed around, oh, this is the only way to design good things or products. There's only one way to do that, apparently. And that's terrible. I don't think then everything becomes homogenous. Everything looks the same. Nothing is then nuanced. Nothing has character. Nothing has like representation from that culture or that craft or anything like that. I feel like there should be multiple methodologies. There should be like encouraging material culture and culture as part of that conversation, and one that is actually about immateriality and spirituality as part of those narratives and principles, because a lot of these principles are like embedded in value systems, and those value systems should be kind of foundational. So care, respect, love and trust, they're the foundations of what design principles should represent. And therefore then adding those other nuanced layers which are more culturally representative, and one that is accepting of difference and allowing for difference. And if anything, universally, we need to be more the foundations of value of being framed around respect, care, love and trust. That should be universal, and then we can like build on that as a structure. And that's something that I've really looked at in my own practice, because the foundational sort of infrastructure of matter is framed around like materials, the immaterial and virtual as the three main domains, and immaterial being more about spirituality and the unseen sort of elements around materials. And then one is about mindsets, behaviors and mechanisms, which are like systems, and reorienting them basically. And then we have another one which is, so there's 12 stages. It's basically like a 12-step program, how I would describe it, because we have gone through like, it's almost like looking at addiction, basically, is how I would describe it. So what I mean by that is we've been so addicted to these consumer sort of habits that we can have anything and anytime at our disposal, and we need to somehow go cold turkey in a way, but do it in stages. And doing it in stages like this 12-step program is kind of giving us a framework in order to do that, basically. So if I go back to it, it's like the material, the immaterial, the virtual. And then we need to readdress ourselves, and understand who we are again, our role as individuals. And then we need to understand how our role as individuals can be implemented in society, so we know what our role is in society, and develop a community around that, or be part of a community. And then we understand that community and our role as individuals towards the planet. And then that shifts our mindsets, behaviors, and mechanisms towards something that has plural futures, and which I call landscapes, and spectrums, which are more like scales, multiple scales, and dimensions is something that is related to time. So multiple time frames, which are connected to those systems. So these 12 steps are kind of helping us towards plural futures, ultimately, which is what we need to be aiming for, and we need to be heading towards, I think, so that it feels more inclusive, it feels biodiverse, it feels nuanced, it feels like it's embracing difference and allowing for it, and rather than this one design principle that is meant for everybody. I just don't think that should exist.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. That I guess if we sort of eradicate the design principles, but then look at some like maybe values, or even could we look at nature? I mean, nature's a subject which we talk about a lot here, and I know you work a lot with natural materials and have a lot of sort of exciting things that you're doing on a level of innovation. But do you think we should maybe just look back at nature, the circular components, nothing is wasted, everything is automatically recycled and regenerated, and it's part of this system which is ever evolving? Do you think that is something we could maybe look at as a design value, as opposed to a strict set of principles?
Absolutely. I mean, like, that's what indigenous cultures do. It's they listen to nature, they worship nature, they respect nature, they offer to nature, and they take as much as they give back. And I think that relationship is framed around animism. Everything is living, everything has a consciousness, and those values and principles are somehow not that present in Western society. And I think that's something that needs to be brought back somehow. I'm not sure how present it ever was, but one, that we start to understand that everything has its own life and consciousness, animate and inanimate beings, I think, not living and non-living. And I think those sets of values start to form a newfound respect around how we treat other things or other beings, and one which is about care, actually. And I think care, respect, these are so foundational to anything that it should be, that for me is sustainability. Care and respect, because we need to think about like how it's about this karmic sort of energy. It's energy a lot of the time, it's kind of like, well, if I respect this, they will respect me back, or if I give you this, I will get this in return. It might not be like for like, but it will be an exchange, and it's karmic. And care and respect, you receive as much as you give. So I think for me, ultimately, that's what sustainability is.
Wouldn't it be a beautiful world if we could all of us collectively abide by those, the basic principles of love, respect, trust, all of these things. And I just don't know if the human trait that it's like a utopian idea of which, I think people need to strive for that. And of course, that's what we should all be doing. But there's always going to be some level of disruption and people that don't. And I don't know if that's just the way that nature's intended, that us humans have to have this conflict of some people are good, they want peace, they want love. Some people want war and money and greed and power. And there's just this constant sort of like conflict. And generally we seem to always be in war and we can't seem to find the peace that we're always looking for. But yeah, it's a very complex thing that gets very deep once you start looking into the ways of nature and how hierarchies exist in nature. And yeah, it's there's a lot of different nuances as you sort of dig deeper into that, for sure. But yeah, completely. I agree. It's all about love, and if we could all do that as a basic value, then yeah, we would all succeed.
But then we also need to look at the polar opposites. I'm not saying that, for me, like I exist in the middle, like a third space. So like everything that I do is always existing in the middle, because we need to respect the fact that they also have polar opposites. So something like respect there's also disrespect. So like what's in the middle? So we need to somehow find a balance, because there will always be good and evil. Like there's also like the shadow self and the self, and like they're always in conflict, or there's like tension there. And that tension is where we kind of need to exist in the middle, this balance. And it shouldn't be devoid. Yeah, it shouldn't be devoid of like what's seen as negative, because actually those discomforting ideas or concepts or qualities actually inform change, basically. So we will never be devoid of anything that's negative or like toxic sometimes, or those things. I don't believe in utopia, actually. I think this idea of like living in the middle has to embrace both sides. Basically, we need to acknowledge that they exist. And during this whole pandemic, for example, there's been a lot of toxicity and evil that's kind of erupted. And even with Black Lives Matter movement, that all of these things, it's like an eruption over and over. Like all systemic issues are kind of being vomited out, into the planet, because the planet's sort of telling us off. And it's kind of saying, well, humans, sort it out and deal with it now. Here we go. So we've got like the pandemic. We've got, which is kind of an environmental issue. Well, actually, consumption and all sorts of things, behavioral. And then we have one towards racism. And that's a whole other systemic issue, which then relates to like all sorts of other areas of equality. And then we have an oil spill in the Arctic. So that's an environmental issue. And the planet's just saying like, you just have to like readdress your relationship with me, basically. And so all of these sorts of impacts are helping us readdress our relationship with ourselves, because we've had some time to reflect, because not many of us are working in the same way as we were. So already we're readdressing our relationship with ourselves through these few months that we've been in lockdown, which is then hopefully going to readdress our relationship to the planet. However long that lasts for, I'm not sure, but at least we're questioning something. And that kind of questioning can only happen through times of discomfort. So acknowledging that discomfort can actually lead to change, basically. So yeah, it's trying to be more sort of aware that needs to happen, actually, or embrace the fact that we have both sides and we can somehow exist in the middle. Well, that's the aim.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think now is the time for change, and we're already seeing all of the cracks that come to the surface. And when you talk about ecology, the environment, equality amongst people, I mean, it's all connected. It's not like they're separate issues, and it's something we've spoken a little bit about on this podcast, of the fact that it's all connected, and unless we really kind of get to the root of getting back to where we do belong, we'll never really sort of fix these issues, because it's all small micro issues that are affecting the whole thing. But yeah, and just going back onto the subject of waste and single-use plastic and things like that. We've sort of been, and especially in Bali, we're seeing a lot of zero waste operations popping up, zero waste stores, and you mentioned like going back to weighing things rather than coming in single-use plastics. That's popping up more and more now. And I know you work a lot with materials that use waste. Is there any specific materials that you're excited about, or anything in particular that you want to share in terms of good uses of re-evaluating waste and really sort of looking at ways of doing things, using sort of discarded materials or whatever to create something new or something useful?
There's so many incredible materials that are looking at waste. One amazing material that I'm just constantly dumbfounded by, like it's just, I don't understand basically, because it's a material that you're familiar with as well, actually, because I brought it to Bali a few times now, and it's the one which is made from the bacteria that exists in coconut water, and the coconut water is discarded of, and it actually is quite damaging to water streams. And it's a material by a studio called Malai, and they're based in Kerala, South India, and they're based in a coconut farm. And this material is just insane to me, because I just don't understand. It's like the bacteria in coconut water is put, well, the coconut water itself is put into a vat, and this vat is then placed into like a humid environment, and obviously South India is very humid, so it's this natural state, so you're not having to like create a humid environment just for that particular material. And that waste coconut water isn't drinkable, so because it's gone off for some reason, or what have you. And there can be thousands of liters that are wasted on a daily basis or a weekly basis. So there's a lot of, it's in abundance, should I say. And so once that material, that coconut water, is put into a vat and left in a humid environment, it then can grow this sort of film or second skin on the surface, which attaches onto Seetal, which is what they use, and becomes really durable and it kind of grows over a period of time of 10 to 21 days, depending on how thick of the texture you want it to be, because it can be paper-like, but it can also be leather-like. And that whole process is just incredible, because if you think about the vat that you place it in, it can be any form. So imagine if you were to grow it into a form which didn't need then cutting, and therefore didn't have extra offcuts and things like this as well. So the whole pattern cutting principles are kind of relooked at as well. So this studio Malai, they end up making small leather goods from it, and it's also incredibly durable but also biodegradable. So it's like going against these two systems in a way. It's actually questioning them. And it's also been made waterproof. It can be naturally dyed, so you can have like options. It's not just got one aesthetic to it as well. So, and it has multiple uses, so it can be small leather goods like wallets and bags and things like this, but it can also be made into furniture or like for upholstery, and then also car interiors, I think they're looking at, and footwear and all sorts of things. So it can go larger scale depending on how large of the vat you end up using. I just find that incredible. Like, it's come from nothing and it's become something, and the visibility and invisibility of this material is just, I don't know, it's a bit mind-blowing to me. I just don't know how they discovered it. It's just, is beyond what's possible, I think. And that's what's incredible about materials. It's just like they present themselves to you and they tell you, oh, you know, if you leave me here for a little while, I can do this. Yeah, and I think that's how she kind of discovered it.
Yeah, it's true innovation right there. I mean, I've got several coconut trees growing in my garden, so I get coconuts, and I always want, like, and I've seen the leather that you did, and I've always sort of thought one day I'm going to make a pair of shoes out of these coconuts, and I will do it. Next time you come to Bali, I'm going to, we'll do it. Yeah, we'll do it, see what we can do with coconuts, because there's a lot of them in Bali or around Indonesia, and they do, surprisingly, I think they give off some sort of gas when they get thrown away. They don't compost as easily as you'd imagine. They give off some sort of gas which isn't particularly good for the environment once they've been used. So yeah, and there's I mean, God knows how many coconuts are getting wasted here in Indonesia. So I think that would be a great project to look at when you're next over.
Yeah, I mean, like the coconut tree itself, there's so many things you can do with that. Whether it's the bark of the tree or the husks from the coconut itself to the shell, and yeah, the versatility of a coconut and the tree itself is just, yeah, magic, I think.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that using one material, but in several different ways. So like the Future Loop sneaker, I think was that just plastic, but they processed it in several different ways. So it felt like seven materials, but it was actually just one material that was processed and felt sort of all different. And I guess that then makes it recyclable, right? So once you're finished with it, it's not then mixed with several materials, it becomes unrecyclable. That one material then gets recycled, and I guess that's probably a good solution to a lot of these design issues as well. It's just how much could you do with one material? And we always mention as well that do more with less. You know, we've got one material. What a great challenge, you know, like let's see what you can make out of one material. And diverse feelings and textures, and it could be an interesting challenge.
Completely. I mean, this is a challenge that I love because it's really similar to cooking. You know, it's one that has so many similarities to like in a domestic environment or like a professional chef, and how far can you push one ingredient? And that sort of creates so many incredible textures and experiences. It changes the entire experience. Like if you cook lamb 3 ways or what have you, you're like, oh, it can be crispy if it's roasted, or it can be like really tender and soft if it's like so cooked. You know, eggs are like, can be cooked multiple ways and they taste entirely different. And the same principles lie with materials, because it's like cooking really, because you're processing it in a similar way. If you blend it, it becomes pulp and therefore could become paper. Or if you shred it, it can be melted and then it becomes something solid. You know, there's just so many ways in which the versatility of a single material can provide so much. It's just endless, I think. That as a principle, like monomaterials is kind of called, basically. I love this so much. It's like one of my favorite ways of expressing materials, and that's a whole translation exercise in itself.
Yeah, it's awesome. And you mentioned cooking there. I guess a lot of people now are at home cooking during the lockdown and pandemic. I mean, I'm personally composting, but I have been thinking a lot lately, like, I could be doing so much with this, even though we're composting and we know it's not going to cause any harm in the environment. It's like, you know, when you're seeing that orange peel getting thrown away, or you're seeing the eggshells, what type of like, have you worked much with food waste and like specifically like maybe everyday ingredients that people are using and throwing away? Have you got any insights on some innovation in regards to food waste?
Yeah, there's so much that can be achieved with food waste, actually. One thing I think is good for is natural dyeing, actually. And that's something that can be achieved in a domestic environment really easily. And because it's one of boiling, really. And whether it's avocado stones that can be turned into a natural dye, or whether it's coffee waste or onion skins, all of these, you know, discarded sort of materials can easily be transformed into a natural dye. and that can be just achieve such wonderful results, I think, because the avocado stone is so deceptive when it actually turns into a natural dye, because it's like this light dusty pink, and you're like, how the hell did that happen? it's kind of like alchemy or magic somehow. It's kind of really surprising and delightful all at the same time. So there's that. I think also, depending on, say, like the food waste itself, because say some ingredients, if it's like the skin of a citrus fruit, for example, it's got this kind of pectin involved, which can be really interesting as almost has like a film-like texture to it, which could be quite interesting to think about as like a plastic alternative. But there's a lot that can be achieved, and I think there's this brand called Orange Fiber they're based in Italy, and they've used citrus waste skins from like oranges and I think lemons and turn it into a textile. And I think that even looking into it as having nutritional qualities in terms of like giving off vitamin C and things like this. So the moisture as well that's involved in the textile itself, I think, is an interesting one as well. So it's not something that can be achieved at home, but I think that as a potential material is really incredible. And I think even brand like H&M are working with them in order to like put it into their product as well. And they receive hundreds and thousands of like citrus peels, I think, on a weekly basis, because they're based in Italy and like citrus fruit there is in abundance. And yeah, that is incredible to me.
Yeah, amazing. So the avocado stone, that's an interesting one, because we as a family, we go through like literally 3 or 4 avocados every day. So I'm going to try that one. I'm going to make a note of that. Have you seen the guys, I can't remember the name of the studio who's doing it, but they're making furniture from orange peels and lemons and things like that. They're making solid furniture. I don't know if you're familiar or you've worked with those guys.
No, I don't think I have. What does it actually look like? It's come from orange?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And I think that's where it gets interesting. Where you would never imagine, you couldn't imagine it came from waste. It looks so slick, and it looks like a block, just almost like a natural stone yellow block. These sort of blocks, and they've turned it into chairs and furniture, and it's pretty nice. And it doesn't look like it came from orange peels, but they're making all sorts of things out of it. So that's a pretty interesting one as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think what's really interesting about using, surpluses, I kind of call them, as materials is they don't end up ever looking like the origin of where it came from. And this sort of familiarity or unfamiliarity as part of this dialogue is really interesting when it comes to using waste as a material. And I think that is when behavior change starts to become really important, because if it looks familiar, it's more likely to be desirable. And I think one of desire and one of aesthetically pleasing sort of outcomes is where behavior change can actually play a role, basically, rather than it looking like, sustainable design way back when it was like using hemp and it looked like these big sacks, and it wasn't one of an aesthetic which was a mass appeal, for example. So I think, at least in the terms of the role of a designer, that's shifted dramatically, I think, and one that has provided a familiar form with an unfamiliar material, and therefore allows for curiosity to be part of the dialogue, actually. And there's a lot more questioning that's involved in a lot of that as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess we're seeing a lot of recycled plastic used at the moment. It seems to be quite a big trend, and people are very interested in that. Whenever they sort of look at it and they go, wow, that used to be several thousand plastic bottles or bottle caps or whatever it is. And I guess it's that familiarity of everybody uses plastic in their daily lives. Everybody kind of knows it's an issue, but when you see it completely transformed into a table or a chair, I think that I see a lot of people who are really reacting to that. Almost, I don't know if it's on a mainstream level, but on a quite a large scale. I'm seeing a lot of sort of people getting quite emotional towards the plastic issue. And then really like in the lab that we have here in Bali, down at Potato Head, people are just drawn into the recycled plastic. They pick it up. It's got that multicolored kaleidoscope effect. And I think that's something which definitely people are familiar with and then are drawn to. And do you feel, what's your thoughts on the whole kind of recycled plastic movement that's going on? Because there's a lot of it, and it's great that obviously oceans are getting cleaned up, and it's very much a short-term solution to a problem that shouldn't exist. It's definitely not the answer, because obviously plastic is, we need to stop using single-use plastic, we know that. But generally, what's your thoughts on this sort of new recycled plastic movement that's happening?
I think it's a good one if it's stopping new plastic being created, basically. And I think it, like you say, it is a short-term effect rather than something that needs to be used forever. Because if it is constantly using recycled plastic, new plastic needs to be generated in order for that plastic to be recycled. So, I mean, there's enough plastic on this planet for us to recycle it. And some plastics actually can be recycled multiple times. Some might say infinitely, which I find kind of interesting. So like, there's a conversation there that needs to happen in terms of like how many times can we recycle this plastic and how many uses can it have, what's its lifespan, kind of thing. So the life and death of materials is kind of an interesting one with plastic, because plastic doesn't really die until 500 plus years. So how many times can it be recycled in order for it to be dead somehow, or like degraded, and the least harmful way possible? So imagine all the plastic we have on this earth. I think it will outlive us, like and future generations. So I don't think it's going anywhere fast. So there's one to be had where if we recycle this amount of plastic, then we shouldn't generate new plastic. So I think there could be something there that happens. I don't know how that happens, all the systems around it, but I think that needs to be addressed, or it should be kind of part of the system somehow, or some kind of policy change potentially. But yeah, I think there should be. It also depends on how much energy is generated or how many carbon emissions are generated while recycling the plastic as well, because I think that also can provide toxicity and it can be quite damaging as well. So I think there needs to be some kind of offset somehow, whether it's energy release or whether it's like the degradability of something to a degree where it's harmful to the planet. So all of these sorts of issues need to be part of this dialogue. And I think one which is being addressed a lot with researchers and scientists right now, I think designers are part of that dialogue as well. I think they need to be part of this conversation along with, say, behavioral scientists or even anthropologists, and also because there's one of culture that needs to happen, there's one of behavior that needs to happen. Policymakers, designers, economists even, I think, need to be part of this conversation. And I think one where it's more a collaborative effort towards these alternative solutions or options, because it's a collective mission and it needs to be done with a collective spirit rather than a single lens. And that's where we've faced a lot of these issues, because it's been seen through one lens and not through multiple.
Great. Well, Yeah, well, thank you so much for your insights, Seetal. Just on an end note, just a woman of your experience and the great work you've been doing at Matter and Beyond. Do you have any advice for young designers coming through today in today's world, in terms of like how they could, design better, or in terms of their own lives, how they could move forward in today's world?
Okay, for one reason, I would say, say the design principles. I would say, don't begin with the product, begin with the material. If you begin with the material, your outcomes will be way more holistic, way more purposeful, meaningful, and you would then start to consider other ecosystems or ecologies that are involved in that, because it's endless. So always begin with the material, and that will begin your own journey to figuring out your own methodology. That includes your culture as well. So always include your culture and always begin with the material.
Beautiful. All right, Seetal. Well, thank you so much. You're a huge inspiration for myself and all the team that have worked with you here at Potato Head over the years. Keep doing your great work, and thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime, Dan. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, as always.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. All right, thank you so much. We'll catch up soon, yeah?
All right, take care.
All right, cheers.